At the time of recording this, there's just under a week left in the current banner where Ningguang is rated up. So if you've gotten her while pulling on it so far, or you haven't yet and hope to, here's a brief guide on Liyue's #1 girl boss. Ningguang can be played as either a main DPS or a burst DPS, depending on whether or not you want her to be your on-field auto attacker or just swap into her for her burst. Either way, she'll provide really high, rock-solid damage. Her kit is pretty straightforward, with only a few but important nuances. Her auto attacks are a little unique from other DPS units as she doesn't have an attack string with different hit multipliers. Instead, she just performs the same normal attack over and over. The only difference is the animation. She either casts straight ahead from her right hand, her left hand, or she'll do a little twirl first. The multiplier is low, but she throws 2 projectiles every time, so it's basically double what it says. Something to note is that her normal attack animations are naturally quite slow and clunky, but you can remedy this by walk cancelling, which is just holding forward while you're attacking, and it reduces the amount of time between casts. Then you just let go to use your charged attack. Every time a normal attack hits an opponent, she accumulates a Star Jade, which you can see floating around behind her, and she can have up to 3 at one time. Her charged attack, in contrast to her normals, has a very high multiplier, and that's where the bulk of her sustained damage comes from. Whenever you use a charged attack while in possession of at least 1 Star Jade, the charged attack consumes no stamina thanks to her first Ascension passive, which is not only a huge quality of life enhancement, but helps to maximize her damage, as well as survivability, as you can and will be using a lot of charged attacks, so you'll still have stamina left over to dodge when necessary. The charged attack will also be accompanied by any Star Jades in possession for some extra damage. Now this might make you think that her optimal attack pattern would be 3 normal attacks into a charged attack to use up all the Star Jades at once, but because of the low multiplier on her normal attacks, she actually does more damage the less auto attacks you do between charged attacks. So her optimal rotation is 1 normal into a charged attack or 2 normals into a charged attack. The former being better within closer range, and the latter being better sometimes when you're a bit further away from the enemy, as when you do 1 normal into a charged attack, the normal attack might not connect, so you won't have a Star Jade, and then the charged attack will cost stamina. 2 normals, 1 charged might also be more comfortable for some players. Her skill summons a Jade screen that does upfront damage when it hits an opponent, produces geoparticles, and is considered a geoconstruct, so it can interact with things like Zhongli's pillars. It can also break when cast too close to other geoconstructs, large enemies, or environmental obstructions, so keep that in mind. It cannot be climbed, but it does block enemy projectiles if placed between you and them. It's on a reasonable 12-second cooldown, but that can be shortened with her second constellation, and it can also change how you use it, but I'll explain that when we get to that section. Her 4th Ascension passive causes any character, including Ningguang herself, to receive a 12% geo damage bonus for 10 seconds when they walk through the Jade screen. And since all of Ningguang's attacks are geo, make sure to walk through it once it's up, especially before her burst. Other geo characters in the party can also benefit from this, so if you stick close to the screen, you can walk back and forth through it as you cycle through their skills and bursts as well, so they get the buff. The shining star of Ningguang's kit is her burst. It can deal massive single target damage, it has a low cooldown of 12 seconds, and a really low energy cost of 40, making it fairly easy to spam whether she's your on-field DPS or you're just swapping into her. When cast, she throws 6 gems at the opponent, and if a Jade screen is on the field when her burst is cast, it fires 6 additional gems, essentially doubling the damage of her burst, so it's really important to have a Jade screen up before you cast her burst. The downside to her burst though is that more often than not, some of the gems will collide with other structures or the environment, so try to avoid casting it too close to other geoconstructs, right next to a wall, or in an enclosed space. Typically though, 8 to 10 gems will hit their target, which is still a huge amount of damage. It can also suffer from auto-targeting problems in AoE settings, as each gem can only hit 1 opponent, so if there are multiple enemies, the gems will be spread out between them, resulting in pretty mediocre AoE damage, but in a single target scenario, the cumulative damage is incredibly strong. Also, always make sure to walk through the Jade screen before casting her burst to get the damage buff, as this results in significantly more damage than if you don't. Her talent leveling priority is straightforward, but it's different if you're running her as main DPS or burst DPS. For main DPS, you want to level her normal attacks first, then her burst, then her skill. And for burst support Ningguang, pre-Constellation 6, level her burst, then her skill, then her normals, But at Constellation 6, you level her burst, then her normal attacks, then her skill, and I'll explain why in the Constellation section right now. Her C1 makes it so that her normal attacks do splash damage and a small AoE. Enemies do have to be pretty close together for them to be hit, so you want to group them or have a crowd controller to take advantage of this. It works really well in Venti's burst, for example. This does not make up for her lack of AoE damage, as the radius is pretty small and her autos don't make up much of her damage anyway, so it doesn't alter her playstyle, but it's just a bit of extra bonus damage when it happens. You can hit more than one iron deposit at a time though, so it can cut down on mining time. C2 resets the cooldown of her skill when her jade screen is shattered, which can happen every 6 seconds. This can come in handy if you accidentally shatter the screen by casting it too close to something, or if an enemy breaks it, allowing you to refresh it to maintain uptime on the geo damage buff. Keep in mind that energy particles will only be generated from casting her screen at least every 6 seconds, so unfortunately you can abuse it by casting 2 screens back to back for batterying purposes, but Ningguang's own energy needs are low, and the particles generated from one screen do a pretty good job of batterying herself and other geo teammates. C3 and 5 are the standard 3 level increase to her burst and skill, C3 being the big one as it levels her burst. C4, to be honest, is one of the most underwhelming constellations in the game. It grants any character near a jade screen 10% all elemental resistance, which I guess can mitigate some damage from certain enemies, but it's definitely not game changing. C6 though is a huge damage spike for Ningguang, and it can alter her playstyle a bit. After casting her burst, she acquires 7 star jades, which look different than the ones that you get from her normal attacks. Upon executing a charged attack while in possession of these star jades, they are all launched at your target, inflicting another huge instance of damage. They use the same multiplier as the jades from her normal charged attacks, which is why if you have her at C6, even as a burst support, you want to prioritize her auto attack talent level after her burst, as it increases the damage from these star jades. Doing a rotation of your skill, burst, skill into a charged attack deals an enormous amount of geo damage in a really short amount of time. Also note that you will lose the star jades if you swap out from her before doing a charged attack, so always follow up your burst with a charged attack before swapping out of her. Ningguang's artifacts are semi-flexible. She has no 4-piece best in slot and instead takes advantage of 2-piece combinations, 2 of which are available from the artifact strongbox, so farming for her can be made a little bit easier. At low AR, just give her whatever gets you the most attack and worry about crit when you can farm 5-star artifacts. At higher AR, her ideal combination would be a 2-piece Archaic Petra for the 15% geo damage bonus and a 2-piece of either an 18% attack set or 2-piece Noblesse. The 18% attack being more versatile as it affects all aspects of her kit as well as helping to increase her tragically low base attack, can be better for a main DPS Ningguang, whereas a burst support Ningguang might favor the 2 Noblesse option, but it depends on your substats and how you play her as to which will be better for you. She also makes great use of a double 2-piece attack percent set if you haven't farmed the Petra domain or if you don't have good Noblesse pieces, so that's a good option as well. A not optimal, but also not terrible set for her is the 4-piece Retracing Bolide. I wouldn't farm this set specifically for her, but if you end up with a really good set while you're farming for Petra, you can use it in the meantime. You do need a shielder who can handle the necessary uptime for the set effect though, so essentially Zhongli. And it doesn't help her burst, but gives her normal and charged attacks a decent boost, which is especially nice at C6. As for Shimenawa's Reminiscence, you can use a 4-piece set if you have fantastic pieces, but you lose out on the potentially better benefits from the other options, and it only increases her charged attack damage. So if you do want to play around with this set, I recommend only doing so at C6. And either way, the previous options will almost always perform better, but if you want to experiment with it since you're probably farming the emblem domain anyway, by all means go ahead, just keep the previous information in mind. And speaking of the emblem domain, a 4-piece emblem of Severed Fate is not valuable for Ningguang. Her energy requirements are too low to begin with, so stacking ER on her for the sake of this set is pointless and it does no favors for the rest of her kit. The good emblem pieces you do manage to get will be much better used by other characters who do benefit from the set. Artifact stat priority is very simple. You want an attack sands, geo damage goblet, and crit rate or damage circlet depending on your substats and weapon to get a balanced ratio. An attack goblet is never better and should really only be used at low AR or if you don't have a geo damage one. For substats, attack percent is key and crit rate or damage to balance your ratio. And I keep saying balanced ratio because since Ningguang's attacks are comprised of multiple smaller hits and her skill only does front-loaded damage, a higher crit rate to damage ratio is sometimes favorable as the higher chance for all aspects of her attacks to hit, the higher potential damage for each of her attacks to do. So a good starting point is 1 to 2, like 60 to 120 is a good minimum, but a 3 to 5 ratio can also be viable. With her burst only costing 40 and her ability to battery herself pretty well, you don't necessarily have to go chasing after ER, but what you can get is helpful, usually being comfortable around 120 to 130%, depending on your team and rotations. Also, as much as it really hurts to roll flat attack, it's not entirely wasted on Ningguang because, as I said earlier, her base attack is very low, so although it's still not desirable by any means, every bit counts. Just like artifacts, Ningguang has no clear-cut best in slot, but her best weapon can depend on your artifacts and how you choose to play her, and whether or not you're using Bennett. So starting with the 5 stars, they are all viable on her with the exception of the donut. Memory of Dust is a limited weapon that can only be attained from weapon banners when it's featured, and I don't recommend pulling for it, especially if you already have another 5-star catalyst. But if you really want to, or if you got it instead of the weapon it was running alongside, it can be good on Ningguang, and in terms of appearance, it looks like it was made for her, but it isn't necessarily the best option. It does have a high base attack and a really high attack percent primary stat, and its passive stacks attack upon attack, and then if you're shielded, it stacks even more attack upon that attack, which sounds good on paper, especially with how many times I mention accounting for Ningguang's low base attack, but it actually causes some issues. It's hard to build around because you'll need to try that much harder to get a balanced crit ratio, and it actually makes attack percent on artifacts less desirable because it provides so much attack that you'll start to encounter diminishing returns even without Bennett's buff. So I really only recommend using this one if it's your only 5-star and or when you're not running Bennett on your team. Skyward Atlas, which you can get from the standard banner, provides a really high base attack as well as a nice attack percent primary stat, but unlike Memory, you won't run into diminishing returns as easily, so you can use it with or without Bennett, and it's easier to build around. It also has a non-conditional elemental damage bonus, and the extra damage from its passive, if you are using her normal attacks, is not negligible. This is probably the closest to what would be her bis if you can get a balanced crit ratio from your artifacts, especially for a burst support Ningguang. Lost Prayer to the Sacred Winds gives a pretty high base attack, a very nice 33% crit rate at level 90, and though the passive is not technically as good as Skyward Atlas's always on damage bonus, as it needs to ramp up, needing 4 seconds of field time for each stack, only competing with Atlas at 2 stacks at R1. However, main DPS Ningguang will usually be on the field long enough to get at least 2 stacks, and it can pull ahead of Atlas, potentially making it her bis instead for this use case. It also makes it much easier to build around her crit ratio thanks to the primary stat being crit rate, and is probably the weapon that benefits the most from having Bennett on the team. Like Skyward Atlas, you can also get Lost Prayer from the standard banner, so if you don't have a 5-star catalyst yet, use whichever one you get first. It's also on the current weapon banner, but I wouldn't recommend pulling on it specifically for this weapon unless you're a whale or you're prepared to go to pity 3 times, which might be 2 future characters, but you do you. Kagoda's Verity is another option, and being another limited banner weapon, I don't ever really recommend pulling on weapon banners, but again, that's up to you. But in general, I would say that this is a much better option than Memory of Dust. The base attack is nice, and it has a sweet crit damage stat, making it really easy to build around for the same reason as Lost Prayer, just with crit rate and damage swapped. And Ningguang can stack the passive on it, especially at C2 because of being able to cast her skill more frequently. So particularly at C2, this is a very competitive option to the standard banner weapons if you happen to get it and can benefit from the crit damage bonus. As for 4 stars, the first one I'm gonna get out of the way is the Widsith. As far as the passive goes, I like to pretend that it just doesn't exist. You have a 1 in 3 chance of getting the Elemental Mastery buff, which is pretty useless for Ningguang, leaving you hoping to get one of the other 2 buffs, but even when you do, it's only for 10 seconds out of 30. So with the downtime and the cases when you do get the EM buff, the damage potential for this weapon is really hit or miss. However, it has a really nice crit damage bonus, so is a good option as a stat stick, and since you can get it from any banner, I'd use it if you get it. And if you don't have or want to spend your star glitter on the Black Clip Agate, which offers the exact same stats with an arguably even worse passive, I also don't recommend spending your star glitter on the Agate unless you really need to, as I personally don't think it's worth it over the character constellations available in the shop, especially since if you can't get Ningguang C6 yet, she's coming back to the shop in September, so you might want to save it. But if you can spare the glitter and really need a weapon, go for it. If you're a Battle Pass buyer, the Solar Pearl is easily her best 4-star. as it also gives a decent base attack and the crit rate stat is desirable. The passive on it, unlike the Blackcliff Agate, has no condition, as it buffs your normal attacks by using your skill or burst, or vice versa, and since you're always going to be casting one or the other, you're constantly going to be getting the buff on all of your attacks. Unfortunately, it doesn't buff your charged attacks, but the added burst damage is especially nice, and it is locked behind a paywall, so it isn't an option for free-to-play players, but for low spenders, it's the obvious choice. Dodo Coattails is a good free-to-play option if you have it, but I'm only mentioning it briefly because it's from an old event and a lot of newer players won't have it. Other free-to-play friendly options such as Frostbearer, though I wouldn't craft it if you haven't already, Eye of Perception, and the Oathsworn Eye are not great options, but they're totally fine for now if it's all you have. Also, if you're running Shimanoa's Reminiscence on her, the Oathsworn Eye will pretty much guarantee that you get her burst back every time you cast her skill. The one free-to-play option that deserves a special mention, however, is the Mapamari, and I know, the Elemental Mastery stat is useless on Ningguang, and it is not good on her at R1. But at Refinement 5, it can grant up to a 32% elemental damage bonus for 10 seconds every time you trigger Crystallize, which against elemental enemies or with certain teammates is really easy to do, and it can actually start to outperform some of the previously mentioned 4-star weapons. So if you're truly free to play and you have the precious billets and resources to craft 5 copies of it, it can be one of your best options. And finally, for my low AR friends, the Twin Nephrite, which is only available from chests, but has a decent base attack for a 3-star weapon as well as a crit rate stat, is perfect for holding you over until you can get something better. Okay, now for team comps. One of Ningguang's biggest pros is also one of her biggest cons, and that is the fact that because she's Geo, she doesn't use reactions. This is nice because she doesn't have to rely on reactions for her damage output, but it does make her a little less flexible in terms of what units to pair her with. Ningguang is really squishy, so she needs a shield, and although not strictly necessary, she kind of requires Geo Resonance, which is one of the only means of Geo Resistance Shred, as well as providing the additional damage boost, but it also needs a shielder in order to be activated. So her uncontested best support is Zhongli, and if you have him, he and Ningguang are basically a package deal. His shield is not only the strongest in the game, but the other way of getting Geo Resistance Shred, and he's obviously Geo, so by using him, Geo Resonance is totally covered. If you don't have Zhongli though, Thoma and Diona can work, Thoma actually being the better option in most cases. And luckily, one of Ningguang's best team compositions is double Geo, double Pyro for both Geo and Pyro Resonance, so Thoma makes up half of both of those. His shield, though not quite as strong as Zhongli's, is really reliable, and it provides interruption resistance, which is especially important for Ningguang being a Catalyst user and not wanting to be interrupted while she's using her charged attacks. Also at C6, Thoma provides a damage boost to Ningguang's normal and charged attacks. Thoma can have really high energy requirements though, so you'll need to run him with a battery. So add Bennett to battery Thoma, as well as providing an incredible attack buff and healing, and then Geo Traveler for Geo Resonance and the crit rate buff, and you have yourself a really decent team. Just be wary of where you place Geo MC's constructs though, as they can obstruct Ningguang's projectiles. Albedo can replace Geo MC if you have him for really high consistent off-field damage as well. Noelle's shield has a long cooldown and low uptime, so I'd only use her if she's your only shielder, or if you're using Noelle as your main DPS and Ningguang as her battery and burst support. Like I previously said, Diona can also work, but she has much better use on other teams, and if you have Thoma, I'd use him instead, unless your Diona is a lot more invested in. As for Goro, since Ningguang scales on attack and not defense, Goro can only buff her if you have a third Geo character on the team, so he's not the best support for her in most cases, but not entirely off the table. Yunjin though is all around not a great support for Ningguang since she only buffs normal attacks, and other Geo units, even Geo MC, are better options if you're just looking for Geo Resonance, and Yunjin is more useful on other teams that can take more advantage of her buff. Ultimately though, as long as you pair her with another Geo unit and a shielder, the last slot can be pretty much anyone. Ningguang's damage per screenshot team is Zhongli, Bennett, and Mona, which allows Ningguang to reach an incredibly high damage ceiling, but other options include Fischl for great off-field damage and batterying. Also 2 Geo, 2 Electro, aka Shock Rock, is also a really fun team. Xingqiu or Yelan can be good off-field sub-DPS options. Venti can help with crowd control and enable Ningguang's limited AoE damage if you ever see one. Xiangling can be a good sub-DPS and Pyro Resonance enabler, as well as provide AoE damage if you're running Bennett. Use pretty much whoever you want that's going to complement your playstyle. Anyway, I think that pretty much wraps it up, and I think this is the longest video I've made so far. That was a lot of information. But I really love Ningguang, and I feel like sometimes she doesn't get the attention she deserves. Some argue that she's not viable in the Abyss, but with Hoyoverse's trend of putting more single target and boss type enemies into the rotations more frequently, she can often be one of your better choices for one of your teams. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think of Ningguang, if you have her or want her, and how or if you like to play her. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos to come. Also, come hang out with me on Twitch where I stream a few nights a week, and I will see you next time.